My sermon passage is Amos chapter 5, verses 18 to 24, page 794 in the Pew Bible. The prophet Amos said, "Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. Why would you have the day of the Lord? It's darkness and not light, as if a man fled from a lion and a bear met him, or went into the house and leaned with his hand against the wall and a serpent bit him. Is not the day of the Lord darkness and not light, and gloom with no brightness in it?" Then the prophet, speaking for God, said, I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and cereal offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fatted beasts I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. The word of the Lord. May God grant us wisdom and courage for interpretation. But let justice roll down like waters. Let's make that clearer. Instead of all that other stuff, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Keep your feasts, God says to God's people. God says to God's own people. That's important. Amos, called to prophesy, first condemns the neighbors of Judah and Israel, but right here, it's Israel itself being singed by the wrath of God. Keep your feasts and your festivals. Keep your assemblies. Keep your offerings. Keep your singing. Keep your new church sign. Keep your landscaping. Instead, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Thus does Amos, called to speak out, set the standard for fiery social justice preaching to and against the religious like us. Which is why this right here, right now, once a week cannot be all that we are about. And it's not at all. It's always a good time for a reminder, especially this time of year, which is for us particularly churchy, isn't it? Well, here's some reminders of who is preaching in this passage, or prophesying, I guess, although I love that Amos denied being a prophet. He said what he had to say, but he didn't want to be associated with the prophets of his day. He was a small town man. He raised livestock, it says, probably sheep. And he kept an orchard. Wasn't a prophet. At least not part of the professional class of prophets, known to kowtow to kings and ignore injustices dealt by wealthy and leading people. You know, I remember being stunned in seminary. There were corps of prophets. They're like trade groups, trade unions, sort of. And they were known. It wasn't just individual people popping off. There's organized prophets. And the ones that I think we remember are the ones that really stood out, probably because they didn't act the way most other prophets act. Don't know that, but isn't that interesting? Corps of prophets, like priests and everything else. But God called Amos anyway to step out of his country comfort zone, to head into town, into the city, and to call them to account for their transgressions, their social sins, their social justice sins. Them. Now, before we can decide what there might be for us in this ancient passage here in the 21st century, we have to know or remember who them were. Who they were, getting scolded in the 8th century BC, some 2,800 years ago. The proverb in some ways is true. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Or maybe it's better to say the more things change around people, the more people stay the same. And then and now they were messed up, needing to be warned. Remember, at this time in the history of the Jewish people, there were two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And Jerusalem was the southern capital of Judah, where the temple was. And in Israel in the north, the capital was the city of Samaria, about 75 miles north of Jerusalem. Amos was preaching in Samaria, the capital of Israel, in the north, as an outsider. I think one of the reasons I like Amos is that he was a country boy sent to the city, like me. And sometimes I have imposter syndrome. I feel like I don't belong here, really, and I'm in Oklahoma City. Even after 20 plus years, I don't feel like I'm from around here. And Amos probably felt the same way about Samaria, where they had ways different than his own. Amos was from a village called Tekoa, I think is how they say it, to the south in Judah, again, where the temple was. And in the north, there was no temple in Israel. Up there, people worshiped God in the old ways, in several places, at different shrines. They had the luxury to do so, to worship all over the place, and so they did. Which is one of the things Amos was on their case about. They were ignoring the reformation of centralized worship at the temple. They were doing their own thing, not what was thought to be God's thing, at least in the South. And that happens when times are easy. National norms and religious practices are allowed to drift. War can change it. A disease can, like a pandemic. But this was a rare time of peace for Israel. That is particularly poignant today, isn't it? It was a rare time of peace for Israel. For generations before that, Israel had had king after king and dynasty after dynasty, most of them short-lived, most ending in takeovers or violence, coups d'etat. But at this time, when Amos was writing, there was stability and peace across the whole region. Israel was getting along with Judah, and the empires that would later defeat them both hadn't come along yet. The economy was booming, and Israel was growing. Somebody had made Israel great again. Times were good, but only a small upper class was actually successful. And they were living large. They ate large, and they drank large, and they built houses large, and other things large, and they put together large estates. And do you know how? It sounds so modern. They lent money, or they actually took pledges from people, and then when poor people and people of modest means who couldn't pay it back, and so then they foreclosed on their property. That's how they built these large estates. But they were outwardly pious. They were very religious. Lots of pomp, lots of ceremony, lots of smells and bells. Since there was no temple in Israel, they had priests at several places of worship, kind of like a multi-site megachurch. And worship was a spectacle. I think they probably tried to outdo one another, the way some megachurches seem to do. More smoke, more big loud music, get more people into the stage for a performance, not worship. That's my editorial comment. They were all blinded by their hubris. Priests, judges, elders, big landowners, and the equivalent then of presidents, CEOs, and chairmen of the board. They thought they could do no wrong. They thought they had God in their pocket. They mistook prosperity and the acclaim of their peers for God's blessing. But they couldn't see what Amos saw, what he said God showed him. The people were blind to God's anger and disgust at their conspicuous consumption, their wasteful living, and their disregard for others. They were fat, happy, selfish, and mean, virtually daring God to step in on behalf of the people and against the top 1%. But Amos said God would step away and leave them to their sorry selves because their economy was rotten, their land use practices were unsustainable, their social safety net had come unraveled, their politics was corrupt, their judges were on the take, their ideology was self-indulgent, their theology was a joke, and their most famous religious leaders were frauds and fakes. And I promise you, I'm talking about the Bible here 2,800 years ago, not the news. This passage is so fiery and so full of condemnation that preachers sometimes go to one extreme or the other with it. They preach it straight, like medicine, if they think the congregation is sick in that far off track, and if they're brave. Or they skip it altogether if they're chicken. Amos who? I'm going to neither extreme. What struck me about this passage this week, when the potential for justice is again hanging in the balance of an election. What struck me was the familiar last verse, echoed famously by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on August 28, 1963 in Washington. No, we're not satisfied, Dr. King said, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. That always strikes me. And how could it not, after so much of the church has done what it's done to itself and to others? And what always gets me as a minister, as a pastor and preacher, is the fakery and the hypocrisy that led to judgment in Amos's time and place, and frankly needs to land on many, if not most, of this country's Christians now, in our time. And that's God saying to God's people, I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies, your offerings. I will not accept them. The peace offerings of your fatted beasts I will not look upon. Take away from me even the noise of your songs and the melody of your harps. I will not listen. Nothing was sacred, so to speak. Earlier in chapter 5, Amos says none of Israel's sacred places would be spared from God's anger at the unjust way people were treating one another. Not Bethel, not Gilgal, not Beersheba. And if those places don't ring any bells, or they ring real faint bells, someone has done the homework for us to remind us who they are. Will Gaffney, the Lutheran Bible professor, explains. Bethel is where Abram's altar was in Jacob's ladder. Rachel's death in the wartime Judge Deborah's judgment seat, prophetic perch, and command and control center, among other holy things. And Gilgal was where Joshua parted the river Jordan, just like Moses parted the sea, and where the wilderness wanderers paused for Passover and other holy acts. And Beersheba is where Abraham's well was, and Jacob's altar, and the boundary of Solomon's kingdom, among other holy places. Is Amos saying that God despised and rejected all of that holy ground? No. Gaffney says the issue at stake for Amos is God's people giving more priority to the place for worship and the way they worship than to the one being worshiped and what the one insists on. But Amos is not saying that God hates worship. Some liberal and progressive Christians misunderstand that, I think. They think that what we're doing right here, right now in worship is a waste of grace, and a waste of time. Lord have mercy. Now, Amos is saying that God expects more than worship. Worship, wherever and however it takes place, without work in the world to spread God's will on earth as it is in heaven, has no point. Worship, wherever and however it takes place, isn't even a good start if it doesn't lead God's people out of themselves, out of ourselves, out of our own comfortable communities, and to people in need. Otherwise, it's just performance. Maybe even just for one another. Because people in need are everywhere, so we have no excuse. Take away from me even the noise of your songs and the melody of your music, God says. I will not listen. What an awful thing to say and to hear. God, what an awful thing to say. But God's holy bombast is not why this passage always strikes me so hard I think of turning the other cheek. Some Bible passages do hit you that hard. It struck me hard this time because we do so love worshiping together. I almost feel like I couldn't live without it sometimes. Especially after we went so long without it because of COVID. You know, we were blessed with online worship, but we were stuck with it. for 59 Sundays in a row. I looked this up. From the 4th Sunday of Lent, March 22nd, 2020, to the 7th Sunday of Easter, May 16th, 2021, we were online only. And then again for 12 Sundays in a row, from the 2nd Sunday after Christmas Day, January 2nd, 2022, to the 1st Sunday of Lent, March 2nd, 2022. The last time was just last year. When you put it like that, you realize we're just barely out of the COVID woods. We really are. Makeshift online worship got us by. Didn't we miss standing and singing and sitting and standing and confessing and sitting and standing and singing and standing and reading the word together, hearing the word together, sharing joys and concerns together, and physically sharing communion in the presence of Christ together? We did. We got by. And as glad as we are to still have Facebook Live and YouTube for people who can't come here to be with us every time. And here I invite among the Facebook faithful who could come here to be with us, to come here and be with us if you're able. The prophet Amos zeroed in on that, on the people's worship, on their festivals, assemblies, and offerings to God, and the singing, which does seem so harsh. He even dismissed the singing. Few things are more personal in church life than how we worship. That's why so-called worship wars erupt, and I'm so glad I missed most of this when I was out of church for 20 years, but I missed it, thank goodness. Hymns versus contemporary music. High church or gospel songs. Screens or no screens. I'm glad we don't have screens. Choirs versus praise bands. Liturgy versus freeform worship. I'm glad I missed all that wrangling and fussing over that stuff. But as someone pointed out, how we worship, how we engage with one another, and what we give to God all speak volumes about who we are. And it stings to be told that they're not right or good enough. So it's no wonder that we have learned to tune out the likes of Amos. May we never forget where we were the first part of last year, and before that, from Lenten 2020 to late in the Easter season of 2021. Where we were was not here. Here's some of what I preached from this passage 3 years ago. We are tuning in, not tuning out. It's so important for us to hear what Amos is saying, especially now, to get a dose of humility, a vaccine against the viruses of pride, indifference, and comfort, because with our usual religious practices on hold, we have nothing to distract us from the call of God, issued through Amos, reiterated by Dr. King, to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. We're doing all right, I think, I wrote then. Not being able to come together to worship didn't keep us from coming together to donate to Black Lives Matter last summer. Not being able to come together to worship didn't keep us from coming together to register people to vote. One of the coolest things we've done, I think. Both of those great collective acts by this little bitty congregation served justice, the biblical kind of justice, which is social justice, which in this country means legal justice and constitutional justice and justice at the ballot box. That's what we donated money for and signed people up to vote for. And not being able to come together to worship hasn't kept us from doing other kinds of church and work as individuals and in twos and threes. It hasn't kept us from having each other's backs, praying for one another, and saying and doing what we can to foster peace and civility, not only among ourselves, but among others we've encountered during these awful, contentious, politically farcical times. Speaking of things that haven't changed much since then, these are awful, contentious, politically farcical times again. The way of righteousness and reconciliation is the only way. It's the only way of biblical righteousness, which is this: living in right relationship with other people, every other people, as best as we can. Faithful but faulty and confessing. Faithful, faulty, confessing, repenting. To God and to those we harm or neglect or mock or deride or cuss. Those people we have sinned against in thought, word, or deed. That's righteousness. It's not a fixed ethical standard, but a quality of life and the way of living. For us as Christians, the way of living is the way of Jesus, who knew the teachings of prophets like Amos and lived them to death, leaving us his example to follow. 3 years ago, preaching at my desk at home, I wondered, so when we do get back to the church house, then what? Do we just go back to the way things were before? No way. We're going to be in person and online from now on. And we are. We have to be. There are people watching and listening and keeping up with us and pulling for us and praying for us and for us who would not be if we were only doing the things we did before. So no turning back, no turning back. Tuberculosis gave the church single-serving communion cups. That's a historic reality. There were shared cups, common cups, until tuberculosis changed the church's ways. COVID gave us, even us, online worship. And since then, hybrid worship, in person and online. But lest we get distracted by that, like the people of Israel were distracted by their worship practices, we have to remember that Creston Hills, northeast Oklahoma City, not the internet, is our home base. And this space right here is sacred space because of what God has done here and through God's people. I keep thinking this and praying for this and hoping for this, and I keep trying as I can to recreate this. Trinity was a destination church. People drove from all over the metro area for the sake of worshiping here, with people here, and with the Spirit of God here. And it can be, again, a place people will drive to for historically integrated worship. That's why I'm here, and that's what keeps me here, that hope. 3 years ago in 2020, I said, sometime next year, thanks to generous donors, we will have a new church sign to remind the neighborhood that we're here. Well, it took a little bit longer than that, but here we are, and out there, our sign is. It has to be more than a sign that people worship here, but a sign that more than worship goes on here. Holy worship is just one of the holy things. Our book of order summarizes what we're supposed to be about, the great ends of the church, and I never get tired of hearing them and meditating on them and reminding myself and y'all of them and trying to live them as a person and a parson. They are, 1, the proclamation of the gospel for the salvation of humankind. 2, the shelter, nurture, and spiritual fellowship of the children of God. 3, yes, the maintenance of divine worship. 4, the preservation of the truth. 5, the promotion of social righteousness. And 6, the exhibition of the kingdom of heaven to the world. Sounds like a tall order, but when Brother Jesus is walking with you and the Holy Spirit's holding us together, it's just what we're called to do. The pandemic gave us time to reflect on what we're here for. It taught us humility, and it taught us some patience. Me anyway, maybe. I still cannot believe, after all, it took 9 months from the time the salesman was out here to the sign went up. 9 months. Babies get born. And we're still not done till the city approves it. Maybe by Advent. But I know better now than to expect that. In the meantime, may we again rededicate ourselves again to answering the call of God through the prophet Amos and Dr. King, again and always, to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, online and in Creston Hills in northeast Oklahoma City, from right here at 2301 Northeast 23rd Street. In the name of the Father who loves us like a mother, the Son, Jesus, who walks with us as a brother, and the Holy Spirit who holds us all together into a beloved, welcoming, working community. Amen.